What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video, and welcome back to my shop finally. So this week's video marks the first part in the series I'm going to be doing on building out the kitchen in the Not So Tiny house. And so I'm going to be going through the process of building all of the kitchen cabinets. But before I dive into the build process, I just wanted to talk for a second about why I decided to make these cabinets myself versus buying them, and maybe some of the reasons you should consider if you're trying to make that choice yourself. So the first thing I would consider is kind of the tools you have at your disposal. Obviously, I have quite a few tools here. You don't necessarily need all of these tools to build kitchen cabinets. In fact, case in point, the miter saw station directly behind you guys, I built years ago using really basic tools, a job site table saw, circular saw, pocket hole jig, and some other basics like a drill and tape measure and stuff like that. So you definitely don't need a full CNC or anything like that to build a kitchen's worth of cabinets, but just know that it is a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of time, and if you don't have a lot of experience with woodworking, a full set of cabinets might be a bit of a stretch. The next thing to consider would be material costs, of course, and the cost of buying materials versus the cost of buying cabinets. There's a lot of things you need to purchase. All of the plywood, of course. I use 3/4 inch plywood for the cabinet carcasses and 1/2 inch plywood for my drawer boxes. If you're going to be doing frameless cabinets like this, you'll need to buy edge banding, or if you're doing face frame cabinets, you'll need to buy the material for your face frames. You'll need to buy all the hardware, so the drawer slides, the door hinges. I'm using leveling feet here, shelf pins, anything like that you're gonna need for installing all of the drawers and doors. And then also all of the hardware, the screws and that kind of thing for building the boxes, the glue, all that kind of stuff. You'll need to purchase your finishing supplies, so paint or polyurethane, and you definitely do not want to cheap out on your finish. Obviously, kitchens are a super high use, high wear space, so invest in a good quality paint or a good quality polyurethane if you're going that route. And last, you'll have to buy some other various odds and ends for cabinet installation, screws, and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff to buy. So altogether, I would expect to spend kind of in the mid $2,000 range. Probably want to add about 10% just to give yourself a little more wiggle room. So I would say 2,500 bucks right now, at least, is a pretty good budget. Now, when we remodeled our kitchen in our main house about 1.5 years ago, I decided to buy cabinets, and I bought what are considered semi-custom cabinets, bought them through Lowe's. They were made by a company called Craftmade, and they were super, super nice. They had all the features that I kind of wanted in cabinets. The cabinet carcasses themselves were made out of plywood. The drawer boxes were solid maple. They were dovetailed together. They had undermount bloom slides. A lot of the features that I used on this project. And those cabinets cost me $6,300 delivered, and it was a very similar number of cabinets, so I would say it would definitely have been in that ballpark range if I went that route for the tiny house. So that's obviously a little more than double the cost of the materials of building them yourself, but obviously that material cost does not factor in time, and that is a big thing to consider. So I have been currently working on these cabinets for about 2 weeks now, full time, 9 to 5, 5 days a week. And so if you're gonna be building these cabinets on nights and weekends, if you're not full time, you can probably expect it to take you a couple of months to build out this many cabinets. That's totally fine, but you just need to, I think, manage your expectations. There's a lot of work that goes into building these types of cabinets. Building the boxes themselves is one of the simpler parts of the process. You have a ton of hardware to install. There's a lot of little customized bits that you will probably run into, and so just expect that it's gonna take a while. The other really big thing to consider is the finish quality. Companies like Craftmade make cabinets for a living. That's their entire business. So they have invested in a lot of machines that make that process faster and give them a better quality, more durable finish. They have UV cured finishes, they have automated paint booths, they have people on staff who all they do is spray finish all day long. So you really are unlikely to get a finish quality as good as a company like that. But I think if you do the prep work you're supposed to do and use good quality finishes, you can get probably 85% of the way there and still end up with really nice cabinets. And case in point there, I built the cabinets for our home bar about 2 years ago now, and they have held up extremely well. I used a tinted polyurethane for the finish. I have seen 0 signs of wear. The only thing actually that's gone wrong on those cabinets is the peel and stick edge banding has started to peel back a little bit, which is driving me nuts. So on this project, I'm using iron-on edge banding, as you'll see. So I think that covers most of the big points in build versus buy. So I guess let's go ahead and dive into the build process on these cabinets here in my shop. Before getting to cutting anything, I first planned out the layout and dimensions of the kitchen cabinetry in SketchUp, and this really allowed me to figure out all of these details ahead of time. And there are a ton of options when building a kitchen like this, and it can definitely be a little bit overwhelming, but eventually I nailed down the options and could move on to the build. To get started, I got some 3/4 inch maple plywood, which I got from Lowe's, loaded onto my big Avid CNC, and got it working, cutting the cabinet parts to size. Now, if you don't have a CNC, I've covered how to cut cabinet parts using more typical woodworking tools in past videos, so you can go check those out, but it was definitely nice being able to batch these parts out relatively quickly with my CNC. So I tried a new CNC cabinetry software for this project, Cabinet Parts Pro, and as with any other software, there was definitely a bit of a learning curve, and as you'll see, there were a few things I had to fix later on because of some incorrect settings in the software. So in total, I used about 12 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood building these cabinet boxes, so I really needed to streamline the process of loading new sheets onto the CNC. And to help get the new sheet squared up quickly with the bed of the CNC, I got these little 1/4 inch slots directly into the spoil board, and these slots can hold some 6mm dominoes. And the dominoes act as alignment pins, and the bonus is if I forget to remove one of them before getting to cutting, the bit can easily just cut away the domino, unlike with something like a steel dowel. After loading the sheet onto the CNC, next I turned on my vacuum pump, which holds the sheet in place, and I did a whole video on setting up my vacuum work holding table in case you're interested in more details there. And then once the vacuum was on, I got the correct bit installed in the spindle. So believe it or not, I've only used 2 bits for all of the cutting on these cabinets, and those were a 5mm drilling bit and a 3/8 inch compression bit. And the 5mm drilling bit was used to drill the mounting holes for all of the drawer slides, which I drilled in the wrong place, but we'll get to that later, and the door hinges, and it was also used to drill the shelf pin holes for the adjustable shelves in the upper cabinets. The 3/8 inch compression bit was used for everything else, including cutting the holes for the adjustable leveling feet, cutting the blind mortises and tenons into the parts, and finally cutting the parts to size. The other advantage of using a 3/8 inch bit is that it's rigid enough to cut through the entire thickness of the 3/4 inch sheet of plywood in a single pass, which is just crazy, and it creates less waste than something like a 1/2 inch bit. Now, the force this bit puts on the pieces while it's cutting them to size is pretty significant, and unfortunately, one of these small stretcher pieces ended up breaking loose while cutting, and this caused the CNC to lose about 2 inches in the X direction because it kind of got held up, and this consequently ruined all of the pieces on this sheet, which was definitely a bummer. So to keep this from happening again, I needed to give the vacuum a little bit of help with its holding power, and to do this, I ran a quick spoil board flattening program, which I should have probably done earlier. And flattening the spoil board really helps improve the vacuum's holding power, since the plywood doesn't have gaps underneath it for air to escape. After flattening, I got the rest of the pieces cut and then got them sorted into piles for each of the various cabinets. This was a little bit tricky considering the sheer number of parts I had cut. Once I got a little more organized though, I realized I had screwed up some of my dimensions on the first 2 cabinets I ran, cutting them to the standard cabinet height of 34.5 inches tall, rather than 30 inches tall to account for my leveling feet. Because of this, I needed to manually add the blind mortise on the bottom edge of the cabinets after cutting the panels to the correct height at the table saw. To do this, I set up a 1/4 inch bit on my router table, and since this was a blind mortise, I needed to stop the cut about 1 inch shy of the front edge of the panels, so I marked where I needed to stop the cut on the router table fence. And you could use a similar process if you wanted to use this kind of blind mortise and tenon joiner in your cabinets, but it would definitely take much longer to do this on a router table than on a CNC. After making the first pass, I adjusted the fence to bring the mortise to a full 3/8 of an inch wide and cut the mortise into the rest of the panels. So before assembling the cabinets, I needed to go ahead and add edge banding to the front edges of all of the cabinet boxes, since these are frameless cabinets with no face frames to cover the plywood edges. And since I was going to be installing a few 100 feet of edge banding on these cabinets, I picked up this little edge banding machine from Rockler, and it definitely saved me a bunch of time during this process. And the machine is pretty simple, and it's basically just a heat gun, a pressure roller, and a fence rolled into one, and the heat gun melts the hot melt adhesive on the edge banding, then you feed your panel across the pressure roller to apply the edge banding onto the panel. The machine also has a guillotine cutter built in, which you smack to cut the edge banding to rough length. And as you can see, I marked a line on the fence to indicate when I should smack the cutter, so I didn't come up short with my edge banding. To trim the edge banding flush with the ends of the panel, I used this little trimmer tool, which cuts the edge banding perfectly flush, and then as a little bit of extra insurance, I rolled the edge banding with a pressure roller while the glue was still hot, just to make sure it was really bonded with the edge of the panel. To flush up the edge banding with the face of the panels, I used yet another trimming tool, but this tool was a little more finicky and I found I had to make multiple passes a lot of times to get the edge banding perfectly flush. After getting the edge banding flush, the edges were super sharp, and to quickly break these edges, I pulled out yet another edge banding specific tool. I rinsed and repeated this process on more cabinet parts, and once the edge banding was applied, I could start getting the cabinets assembled, starting with one of the base cabinets. So I did add a little glue to the mortises on these cabinets just for some additional strength, but I really don't think it was totally necessary considering all of the extra strength these mortise and tenons provide. And as you can see, having all this joinery makes the assembly process a lot easier as all the pieces line up and kind of lock into place. And I just tacked the parts together with my narrow crown stapler as I got them assembled. Once all the parts were added to one side, I added the other side panel, and then I could get all of the pieces tacked in place on that side. And when doing this, I was really focusing on keeping the edges lined up nicely, as that'll really be the only visible part of the cabinet once they're installed. Also, you can see why a lot of cabinet makers don't bother with glue, as it can make a huge mess if you're not careful. After cleaning up my mess, I came back and reinforced all the joints with screws. Not just any screws though, these screws are, in my opinion, a total game changer for assembling cabinets. So these screws are made by Spax and are designed specifically for screwing into MDF and hardwoods with no pre-drilling. And this little chisel tip essentially pre-drills the hole as you drive in the screw, and I drove hundreds of these screws while assembling these cabinets with zero splitting. And I'll link to them in the video description in case you're interested. I also made sure to check the cabinet box for square after assembly by measuring the diagonals, and as expected, they were pretty much perfect. I used 1 3/4 long screws here, and between the mortise and tenons, glue, staples, and these screws, these cabinet boxes are super strong. So the wall cabinets went together mostly the same as the base cabinets, connecting the side panels with glue, nails, and screws. And the only big difference here was the back panel on the wall cabinets was inset, so the plywood edges wouldn't be visible on the bottom of the cabinet. And because of this, I had to screw through the bottom of the cabinets to attach the bottom to the back, and I'll come back and fill these screw holes later so they won't be visible in the final installation. This huge cabinet was a little bit different as it had a fixed shelf in the middle to keep the cabinet from bowing out, but otherwise it went together in the same way. From there, I just continued working through edge banding and assembling cabinets, and this process went super quick since I didn't have to worry about using any concealed fasteners, since all of the sides of these cabinets will be hidden in the final installation. And that's because I'll be adding some finished end panels to the 2 areas in the kitchen where you'll actually see a cabinet side, and those end panels will cover all of the screw and nail holes, plus they'll make the drawers have kind of an inset look, and that'll give these cabinets a little bit more of that modern look that I'm going for. And I've typically used a lot of pocket screws on previous cabinet builds, and they're great when the sides of cabinets are going to be visible because obviously they can be hidden, but they're also a lot slower since you have to drill the pocket holes and then clamp everything together. So just take that into consideration when planning your cabinet joinery. One other big pro tip here is to add some sacrificial strips to the bottom of your base cabinets, and this is a tip I picked up from the NS Builders channel. And these strips allow you to slide around the cabinets on the shop floor without worrying about damaging the edges, and this is something I'll be doing on all of my future cabinet builds. Once I had all the cabinet carcasses assembled, I could move on to getting some hardware installed, and I'll cover all of those details in the next video in this series. I use this super cool touch to open hardware from Bloom on all of the drawers and doors. There will be no handles in this entire kitchen, and I cannot wait to show you guys how that all came together. It is super cool. So if it's your first time here, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that notification bell so you don't miss the future videos in this series. Also, I'll link to all of the tools and materials I used in the video description below. And last, I want to say thanks to my Patreon and YouTube member supporters. You guys are awesome. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy building.